What if, what if literally everything you've been told about the phrase consenting adults is just, built on an ancient Greek myth?
That is a wild place to start.
Right. But I don't mean it as a rhetorical question. Like, what if the entire modern framework that we use to navigate physical intimacy is resting on this massive philosophical mistake? A mistake that accidentally makes our bodies completely meaningless.
Yeah, that's the kind of question that just totally upends how you view the world.
It really does.
Because if you get the fundamental nature of a human being wrong, every ethical conclusion you try to build on top of that misunderstanding is just going to fracture under pressure.
It's going to collapse. So we are jumping straight into the deep end today.
Uh-huh.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission for you in this conversation is to explore a profound and honestly wildly misunderstood topic.
Very misunderstood.
Yeah. We're looking at a comprehensive canonical and theological account of covenantal relationships and biblical sexual ethics.
Hmm.
And we're pulling from an extensive theological study paired with a really highly accessible primer to help us navigate all this material.
Which is super helpful because this stuff can get dense.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. We are going to completely reframe this conversation right from the very first second.
Love that.
We are tossing out the giant manual of do-nots. We are ignoring the culture war slogans. We are not, absolutely not, starting with a list of forbidden acts.
Right. And the sources actually insist on that exact reframing.
Yeah.
Because if you start with a list of rules, you're already having the wrong conversation. The primary question isn't, what rules apply to me?
Right.
The real foundational question the biblical text is actually asking is, what kind of beings are we, and what does sexual union actually do?
What does it do? Exactly. Setting the tone here is just paramount. Because I know anyone who grew up in certain religious environments might feel a literal knot in their stomach just hearing the topic.
For sure. A lot of trauma there.
So much. So many of us were handed this framework that implicitly treated the body as dirty or suspicious or, spiritually secondary.
A necessary evil you just have to deal with.
Exactly. But on the flip side, if you're looking at the modern secular world's consenting adults framework, you might be noticing that it promises ultimate freedom, but, it often delivers profound anxiety and burnout and isolation.
Yeah, people are feeling really isolated.
They are. So what we are exploring today is a radically different, deeply beautiful, and morally serious third way.
And I think it's important to note that this third way, it begins at the absolute beginning of the biblical narrative. Like, Scripture does not begin with suspicion.
Right, page 1.
Exactly. It does not begin with a warning label. It begins with creation. God made humans embodied, male and female. And he looked at that physical, embodied reality and called his creation good.
Good. The word good there is doing a ton of heavy lifting. It means the physical world isn't a mistake.
Yeah.
Which, okay, that brings us back to that ancient Greek myth I mentioned at the top.
Meat suit myth.
The meat suit myth, yes. I call it that because there's this pervasive, almost invisible assumption in our culture that the real you is a soul or a consciousness or like an inner spiritual self.
Yeah, your true self.
Right, and your body. Your body is just a temporary container. It's a biological vehicle you're driving around for 80 years until you finally ditch it and fly away.
The ghost in the machine concept. I mean, we see it everywhere.
Totally.
It is basically the underlying philosophy of almost every sci-fi movie, where someone downloads their consciousness into a computer or they swap bodies.
Oh, yeah, like altered carbon or something.
Exactly. It assumes the body is just the hardware and the real you is the software.
I think about how often we hear this at funerals, too. Like, people will point to the casket and say, well, they aren't really there. That's just their shell.
Yeah, people say that a lot.
And it sounds comforting in the moment, but the sources we were looking at are adamant about this.
Yeah.
That idea. It comes from ancient Greek philosophy, specifically Plato. It absolutely does not come from the Bible.
Not at all. The biblical view of the human person is stunningly integrated. I mean, Genesis 2.7 paints a picture that just shatters that Platonic dualism.
Walk us through that.
So the text says God formed man of the dust from the ground, right? And then he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature.
He became a living creature.
Right. The Hebrew phrase used there is nefesh chaya. Now, English Bibles often translate nephesh as soul.
Which is confusing for us today.
Super confusing. Because in the ancient Hebrew imagination, nephesh does not mean a detachable, immortal, invisible wisp of spirit living inside a temporary physical shell.
Okay, so what does it mean?
It refers to the living person as a unified whole. It is the dust animated by the breath. You literally cannot separate the two and still have a human being.
So to put it as plainly as possible, man didn't receive a soul, like slipping a letter into an envelope.
No.
Man is a living soul. The person is the embodied creature.
Exactly. The body is the created form of human life. Humans don't just, possess life as an independent substance tucked away inside a physical pocket somewhere.
Right.
We live because God sustains us breath by breath in our physical forms.
Okay, I can hear someone listening right now asking, why are we spending 10 minutes on ancient Hebrew anthropology in a deep dive about sexual ethics?
Fair question.
Let me try to bridge that gap. Think about renting a car from the airport. I don't really care what happens to that car, as long as it gets me to my hotel, right?
Right.
If it gets a scratch on the hubcap or someone spills coffee on the floor mat, it doesn't affect my core identity. I just drop the keys off and walk away.
You're not deeply attached to the rental.
Exactly. So if we view our bodies as rental cars, if we view them as meat suits, then what we do with our bodies is spiritually secondary. Sex just becomes something that happens to the rental car.
Which is the exact philosophical loophole people use to claim that physical intimacy can be casual or meaningless.
Bingo.
The logic basically dictates that if the body isn't the real me, then the body's actions don't actually touch the real me.
But if the body is the person, that entire loophole just collapses.
It collapses completely.
Yeah.
If there is no dividing line between your body and yourself, then what the body does, the person does.
That's huge.
The Apostle Paul makes this argument forcefully in 1 Corinthians 6. He is writing to a church that was completely immersed in that Greek dualism.
Oh, Corinth was wild.
Very wild. And he tells them, glorify God in your body. Notice he doesn't say glorify God in your inner spiritual life despite your body.
Wow, yeah.
He argues that the body belongs to God because the person belongs to God.
That elevates the physical body to a place of incredible, almost terrifying dignity.
It really does.
Your physical form is not a disposable husk. It is you. And if we pull that thread, we arrive at the core mechanic of the biblical sexual ethic. Because if we are our bodies, then what happens between bodies in sexual union happens between whole persons.
Absolutely. And the sources introduce the biblical concept of one flesh to explain this. In Hebrew, it's basar echad.
Basar echad.
Right. We see it first in Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.
In the modern cultural framework, we treat sex like a handshake.
Right.
Two independent parties meet, they negotiate an agreement based on mutual consent, they shake hands, and then they let go and walk away completely unchanged.
Yeah, that's the narrative.
They are the exact same people they were before the handshake.
Yeah.
But this basar echad concept, this one flesh reality, it suggests the handshake analogy is completely false.
Oh, it completely rejects it.
It sounds more like a chemical reaction. You take two distinct, stable elements, you introduce them to each other, they bond, and they form an entirely new compound. And you can't easily unmix a chemical reaction.
You really can't. And the text treats one flesh not as poetic language or, a romantic metaphor for a pleasant emotional connection.
It's not just a Hallmark card.
No, it is a literal anthropological description of what the act actually does. Because the body is the person, the act creates a real, profound, objective union between persons. Something structural actually happens between them.
Jesus leans into this heavily in Matthew 19, doesn't he?
He really does.
He treats the Genesis passage as the ultimate normative reality of creation. He says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. He is talking about a structural reality that humans literally do not have the authority to casually dismantle.
And Paul takes that exact structural logic and applies it to a very gritty, real-world scenario in Corinth.
Right, back to Corinth.
The believers there were visiting prostitutes, and they were justifying it using their Platonic worldview. Their slogan was essentially, food for the stomach and the stomach for food.
Which is just reducing sex to a biological function. Like, I have an appetite, I'm fulfilling an appetite, it means nothing.
Yes. And notice how Paul dismantled that argument. He doesn't just quote the 10 Commandments and say, stop doing this because it is forbidden.
But he goes deeper.
He goes to Genesis 2:24. He tells them that whoever is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her. He is applying the one flesh reality to a commercial transaction.
That is fascinating. Paul is saying that even if you pay for it, even if you try to make it purely transactional and strip all the emotion out of it, the act still does what it was designed to do.
You are still triggering the chemical reaction.
Wow.
The theological weight of that is immense. Sex matters because your body is a member of Christ. You cannot participate in the act and remain unchanged because it involves the whole person.
Yeah, you're taking a unified self that belongs to Christ and joining it to another in a way that intrinsically, inescapably forms a bond.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we follow the logic of the sources here, this raises an incredibly practical question.
Go for it.
If this chemical reaction happens every time, if sexual union inherently forms a profound, lingering bond between persons, what on earth do we do with that bond?
Right. How do you manage it?
How is it supposed to be held so it doesn't destroy us? The sources call the answer to this the container.
The container. Because the act is union forming by nature, it is also covenant directed by nature.
There's more about that.
Well, you cannot generate that kind of profound vulnerability and bonding without needing a protective structure to house it. The sources argue it requires a covenant home.
Okay, we need to define what that covenant home looks like. The sources break down the structure of marriage into 4 distinct components. It's faithfulness, exclusivity, public responsibility, and durable commitment.
Those 4 are key. And the crucial thing to understand here is the order of operations.
The order of operations, right?
A wedding ceremony doesn't magically manufacture a significance that the sexual act didn't otherwise have. The covenant structure exists because of the inherent power and weight of the act itself.
To stick with our earlier analogies, imagine you own a priceless, incredibly fragile heirloom.
Okay.
You don't take that heirloom and pass it back and forth over a concrete floor without a net, just hoping neither of you drops it.
That would be insane.
Right. You build a vault first, you set up a state-of-the-art security system, you pad the walls, you ensure the environment is perfectly controlled, and then, only then, you place the heirloom inside.
Yes.
But what the consenting adults framework often encourages is putting the heirloom out on the front lawn, exposing it to the elements, and then maybe, trying to build a vault around it 5 years later.
It's totally backwards. The commitment should precede and surround the extreme vulnerability of the act, not follow afterward as an afterthought or, a response to an accidental pregnancy.
Yeah.
This is exactly why repeated sexual unions outside of this covenant home are treated with such moral seriousness in Scripture. You are repeatedly triggering the bonding mechanism of your own humanity.
You're forming a one-flesh reality.
Right. But you're doing it without any structural framework to honor, protect, or sustain what is being created.
It sounds like a recipe for deep psychological and spiritual fracturing.
It absolutely is.
You're basically demanding your body to bond with someone while simultaneously telling your mind to keep a safe distance because there is no durable commitment holding you both.
And stepping back to look at the bigger picture, this covenant structure isn't just a pragmatic social arrangement, to keep property rights organized or society orderly.
Right, it's bigger than that.
In the biblical imagination, the marriage covenant carries the weight of the cosmos.
Marriage is doing an unbelievable amount of heavy lifting in the Bible. I mean, it is the ultimate divine metaphor.
If you trace the concept through the Old Testament prophets, specifically Hosea, Isaiah, and Ezekiel marriage, is the primary image used to describe Yahweh's covenant with his people, Israel.
Hosea is probably the most visceral, almost uncomfortable example of this, wouldn't you say?
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, God actually tells the prophet Hosea to marry a woman named Gomer who will be unfaithful to him. Hosea lives out this agonizing public metaphor of how God experiences Israel's spiritual unfaithfulness. It is incredibly raw.
It is raw. And the entire logic of that prophetic analogy relies on the nature of the marriage covenant. It demands self-giving love, exclusive commitment, and intense vulnerability held safely within faithfulness.
Yeah.
Betrayal is portrayed as personally devastating, precisely because the covenant was meant to be exclusive and permanent.
Right. If it was just casual, it wouldn't hurt.
Exactly. When Isaiah 54 talks about the Maker being a husband to his people, or when Ezekiel 16 goes into shocking detail about the marital covenant between God and Jerusalem, they are elevating human marriage to mirror divine faithfulness.
Then you turn to the New Testament, and Paul takes this metaphor and anchors it to the gospel itself.
Yes, Ephesians 5.
Right. In Ephesians 5, Paul is talking about husbands and wives. He quotes that exact same one flesh verse from Genesis 2, and then he says, "This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church."
Marriage doesn't just illustrate Christ's love for the church like a handy sermon illustration a pastor might use.
Not a prop.
Right, not a prop. It participates in and points toward that ultimate reality. The self-sacrificial love of a husband and the faithful love of a wife are meant to be a living, breathing theater of the gospel.
I really want to pause and make sure we absorb this. Because if you are listening to this and wondering why the Bible seems so intensely focused on sexual ethics, This is the answer.
This is it.
It isn't because God is some cosmic killjoy who hates pleasure. It's because we are dealing with an image, a reflection of the most important relationship in existence, God's covenant with his people.
Yeah.
When the Bible talks about keeping the marriage bed undefiled, it is protecting a masterpiece.
And when you grasp the stakes of that cosmic metaphor, you realize the biblical framework is not aiming to repress human flourishing at all. It is elevating human intimacy to a place of supreme honor.
That is such a beautiful design. But we have to talk about what happens when things go wrong. Because we obviously do not live in the Garden of Eden.
We certainly don't.
We live in a profoundly broken world. But before we look at how the sources categorize that brokenness, they make a really critical pit stop. We have to establish unequivocally that sexual desire itself is not the problem.
This is a vital corrective for anyone carrying trauma from overly restrictive religious upbringings.
For the purity culture stuff.
Exactly. The sources point straight to the Song of Songs. Placed right in the middle of the biblical canon by the same God who handed down the law at Sinai is an entire book composed of unapologetic, incredibly vivid, erotic poetry.
Celebrating embodied sexual love between a man and a woman. The early church fathers actually struggled with the Song of Songs. I mean, they try to allegorize the whole thing as just being about Jesus and the church because the physical descriptions made them so uncomfortable.
They didn't know what to do with it.
But the text is undeniably about human physical desire. God isn't looking at human attraction and saying, oh, I wish I hadn't designed them that way. The desire itself is not dirty.
No, and the text requires us to aggressively reject two opposite errors that have plagued this conversation for centuries.
I'll take the first error, which is the Platonic purity culture error. This is the view that treats sex as inherently dirty, highly suspicious, or at best, a spiritually inferior concession to human weakness.
It's just something you tolerate for procreation.
Right. It views physical desire as something to be deeply ashamed of. It teaches people that they are essentially ticking time bombs of lust that need to be managed through intense shame.
And then the second error is the modern liberal permissivism error. This view swings the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme, treating sex as a totally morally neutral biological function.
Like drinking a glass of water.
Right. It argues that physical intimacy only has meaning if the people involved actively choose to assign meaning to it. In this view, the only moral requirement is mutual, enthusiastic consent.
The sources make a compelling case that both of those errors fail the biblical text completely. Purity culture fails because it denies the inherent goodness of God's physical creation.
Yeah.
And permissivism fails because it denies the profound union-forming reality of what the body actually does, regardless of our intentions.
So, to navigate between these two massive errors, the sources argue for a framework of moral clarity joined with moral proportion.
Okay, I have to stop you there and push back.
Okay.
Because the immediate response from almost anyone raised in a modern evangelical church is going to be James 2.0.
Yeah.
For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it.
Classic proof text.
Right. I've heard my whole life that all sin is the same to God. You tell a white lie, you rob a bank, you commit adultery, it's all the same. It all separates you from God. How does this idea of moral proportion survive that text?
It survives because that reading of James is a common but profound misunderstanding. When James writes that, he is talking about our status as lawbreakers before a holy God.
Our status.
Right. If you break a single law, your status changes from innocent to guilty. You are a lawbreaker in desperate need of grace. But James is absolutely not talking about the gravity or the weight of the sin itself.
Being a lawbreaker doesn't mean all broken laws carry the exact same destructive weight.
Exactly. Jesus himself makes this distinction incredibly clear. In John 19, Jesus tells Pilate that the one who handed him over has the greater sin.
He explicitly says greater sin.
Yes. And in Matthew 23, Jesus rebukes the religious leaders for tithing their spices but neglecting the weightier matters of the law, like justice and mercy.
Weightier matters.
Right. And in Luke 12, Jesus describes a servant receiving a severe beating versus a light beating based on their level of knowledge and responsibility.
So the idea that God views all sins as perfectly equal in consequence, damage, and severity is just not a biblical concept.
It simply isn't. All sin requires the blood of Christ for atonement, yes. But Scripture explicitly teaches that certain actions carry far greater moral weight and cause exponentially more destruction.
That makes sense.
Therefore, while sexual intimacy absolutely belongs exclusively within the marriage covenant, Scripture does not treat every departure from God's design as equally grave. We must maintain moral seriousness, but it has to be married to moral proportion.
That is a massive relief. It stops us from flattening everything into one giant, terrifying category of bad, where, a teenager struggling with thoughts is treated the same as someone actively destroying their family.
Exactly. It's not helpful.
Let's use this proportionate framework to look at the actual categories of sexual brokenness the Bible outlines. And we need to keep remembering, the goal here isn't to build a catalog of rule-breaking. The goal is to see how Scripture is fiercely trying to protect persons as image-bearers of God.
The protection of persons is the whole point.
Right. So let's start with the heavy of hitter, adultery.
The biblical terms for adultery, mochia in Greek, naph in Hebrew, these are highly precise technical terms. Adultery specifically requires a married party.
It's not a blanket term.
No, it is not a catch-all term for any sexual activity outside of marriage. It is the specific intentional violation of an existing covenant bond.
And it receives the maximum moral weight in the biblical framework because it acts like a wrecking ball. It destroys a structure that was deliberately built to protect vulnerable people.
Yeah.
The sources use the devastating cascade of David and Bathsheba from 10 Samuel as the prime example of this gravity.
It is a terrifying picture of total structural collapse.
You read that story, and the ripple effects are just staggering. David is on his roof. He sees Bathsheba. He uses his power to take her. She becomes pregnant. To cover up his sin, David has her husband, Uriah, murdered on the battlefield.
It just spirals.
It completely spirals. The child conceived from the affair dies. The trauma infects his entire household. Later, David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. Tamar's brother Absalom murders Amnon in revenge. Absalom then leads a full-scale, bloody rebellion against David.
It's horrific.
It's a multi-generational cascade of death, rape, betrayal, and national instability, all stemming from one shattered covenant.
And the text highlights that the destruction is not incidental, right? It is the direct, chaotic consequence of removing the protective structure that was holding all of those persons in safety.
That vault we talked about earlier.
Yes. That is why adultery carries such immense specific moral gravity. It violates the spouse, it breaks the vow made before God, and it shatters the protective home.
The next category the sources define as porneia. Now, if you read an English Bible, this is usually translated as sexual immorality. But what is it exactly? Because it seems to get applied to almost everything.
It does get applied to everything, but porneia is actually a broad, flexible category that requires very careful handling. Etymologically, it traces back to the world of prostitution and the selling of persons.
The selling of persons.
Yes, but in Jewish and early Christian usage, the definition broadened out. It isn't strictly limited to commercial sex, but importantly, it also isn't just a flattened, generic term for all sex outside marriage of equal weight.
Okay, if it isn't just a catch-all, how do we define the boundary of what porneia is?
It refers to conduct that fundamentally violates covenantal, bodily, or holiness boundaries. The prophets frequently used it metaphorically for idolatry, the act of giving to false gods the worship that belonged only to Yahweh.
So it's about treating something sacred as common.
Yes. The core concept is about taking something intimately personal and covenantal and treating it as a commodity, a transaction, or a defilement. Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 6 when addressing prostitution, noting that this specific sin is a sin against the body in a uniquely profound way because of the one-flesh union we discussed earlier.
If porneia requires an action or a physical crossing of boundaries, what happens when there is no physical touch? What if the commodification happens entirely in the mind? Does the moral weight just vanish? That leads us to the next category, covetous desire. The Greek word is epithumia.
Epithumia.
And this brings us to what might be the most famous and the most universally misunderstood verse about sex in the entire Bible, Matthew 5:28. Jesus says, "Everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart."
Yeah, the interpretation of that single sentence has caused more unnecessary anxiety and shame than almost anything else in the New Testament.
Let me voice the fear that so many people have reading that. Does this mean that simply noticing a beautiful person walking down the street is a sin?
A lot of people think that.
Am I committing adultery in my heart because my brain, acknowledged that the barista at the coffee shop is incredibly attractive?
The sources clarify this beautifully by looking at the specific Greek word Jesus used, epithumia. This is not a general word for normal biological desire or aesthetic attraction.
Okay.
It is the specific word for covetous, acquisitive, possessive desire.
Covetous. Like the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house or thy neighbor's wife.
The exact same concept. The grammatical construction Jesus uses implies looking with the deliberate purpose of consuming, possessing, or acquiring. There is a predatory, calculating intentionality to it.
Wow, so it's active, not passive.
Completely active. Jesus is condemning the acquisitive, consuming gaze that reduces a human person to an object for personal gratification. He is absolutely not condemning the body's natural neurological response to noticing physical beauty.
The relief that distinction brings just cannot be overstated. There's a universe of difference between seeing a person and appreciating their beauty as an image bearer of God versus looking at them and mentally stripping away their humanity to turn them into an object for your own consumption.
Which brings us directly to the most pervasive modern manifestation of that consuming gaze. The sources apply these categories directly to pornography.
This is critical because pornography is practically the water we swim in culturally now.
It really is.
And the sources treat it with profound moral seriousness, not just because it is a dirty habit, but because it actually represents a catastrophic convergence of multiple biblical categories of harm simultaneously.
If we break it down structurally, pornography is, at its foundation, porneia. The root of porneia involves the commodification and selling of persons.
Yeah, and pornography literally does that.
Right. It turns human beings into digital sexual commodities to be consumed by strangers. It fundamentally reduces persons to objects in the exact domain where they were designed to be most fully and personally engaged.
Furthermore, the act of consuming it is epithemia in its purest, most distilled form.
It is. The consumer of pornography is actively practicing and refining the consuming, acquisitive gaze Jesus warned about. It is not passive entertainment. It is the active training of the human heart to view image bearers of God strictly as objects of acquisition.
And beyond the spiritual damage to the viewer, there is structural participation in exploitation.
The modern demand of the viewer directly funds and sustains the supply. Even if a specific performer claims enthusiastic consent, the viewer is structurally participating in a massive global system that requires the objectification and, tragically, often the coercion or trafficking of vulnerable persons to function.
We also see the observable psychological pattern of escalation, right?
Absolutely.
The medium itself trains the brain's appetite toward novelty, higher intensity, and increasingly dehumanizing forms of consumption just to achieve the same dopamine baseline. The damage isn't just isolated to the persons on the screen. It profoundly damages the soul and the relational capacity of the person watching.
It trains you to consume instead of connect.
Exactly. So under the biblical framework, pornography receives one of the clearest and most severe condemnations because it is a multi-front structural assault on the dignity of the image bearer.
That is the crucial lens. The Bible isn't condemning it just to limit your pleasure. It is condemning it to protect human dignity.
So we have looked at adultery, porneia, epithemia, and pornography. All of these carry massive destructive weight. But what about premarital sex between two consenting adults who genuinely care for each other?
Right.
Where does that fit in this proportionate framework? Because we established we aren't flattening everything into one equal category.
This is where moral proportion is absolutely critical and where the traditional restrictive view sometimes overplays its hand. The sources argue clearly that premarital sex is not morally equivalent to adultery, abuse, prostitution, or the structural exploitation of pornography.
But, and this is a vital but, that distinction does not mean premarital sex is morally weightless or permitted.
It is an argument of proportion, not permission. Why is it not weightless? We have to go all the way back to our foundation.
But the one flesh.
Yes. The act itself is inherently union-forming and covenant-directed. If two unmarried people engage in sexual union, they are still forming a profound whole-person bond. The act still does exactly what Genesis 2 says it does.
To bring back the vault analogy, it isn't that you are taking a hammer to the heirloom, which would be adultery.
Right.
But you are still choosing to toss a fragile, priceless heirloom back and forth over a concrete floor without a net.
Taking the union-forming act outside the marriage bond designed to protect it is seriously unwise and unfaithful to the biblical design. It is an attempt to bypass the covenantal reality of what the body is actually doing.
And the Old Testament context actually backs up this proportional view. If you look at Exodus 22 or Deuteronomy 22, the civil laws regarding an unbetrothed virgin engaging in premarital sex treated the act as a very serious matter.
He definitely took it seriously.
Right, required restitution, paying the bride price, and taking permanent responsibility. But crucially, it was not treated as a capital offense, and it was not treated as the violation of an existing covenant, which adultery was.
Scripture treats it with genuine weight. but it carefully distinguishes it from the gravest sins that destroy existing covenants. Flattening premarital sex to equal adultery distorts the Bible's own moral scales and often leads to crushing shame.
Yeah.
But honoring that distinction does not mean we pretend the act is harmless.
Having laid out this positive biblical case, the foundation of the body, the reality of the one-flesh union, the necessity of the covenant container, and the framework of moral proportion, the sources argue we can now look at modern disputes with much more clarity and pastoral care.
This is an important pivot.
It is. Let's address same-sex relationships, and we are going to impartially report what the sources say here.
Before diving into any theological or textual arguments, the sources draw a crucial, absolute pastoral distinction that must be stated with total clarity. There is a massive, fundamental difference between same-sex attraction and same-sex activity.
Meaning, temptation or orientation is not a sin.
The unchosen experience of being attracted to the same sex is not in itself a moral failure. The writer of Hebrews points out in chapter 4, verse 15, that Jesus himself was tempted in every respect as we are, yet without sin.
He was tempted, yet without sin.
Right. Treating a believer who experiences same-sex attraction as if they are morally defiled by that attraction, or treating their temptation as a sin in itself, is both unbiblical and profoundly cruel.
An immense amount of harm has been done to the church by blurring that specific line. The sources emphasize that believers navigating this reality need truth, patience, honor, and deep integration into a real spiritual family, not silence, suspicion, or condescension.
Absolutely.
But let me step into the shoes of what the sources call the progressive affirmation argument on the activity side.
Okay, let's hear it.
The argument usually goes like this. We understand the ancient biblical prohibitions, but those ancient writers were only familiar with exploitative same-sex practices like Roman pederasty, cultic temple prostitution, or masters abusing slaves.
Right, that they lacked a modern category.
Exactly. They had no concept of a modern, mutual, loving same-sex marriage. So, if a modern same-sex relationship is faithful, exclusive, and covenantal, doesn't that meet the biblical standard of love?
It is an argument rooted in a genuine, compassionate, pastoral instinct. But the sources argue that it fails when brought to the actual biblical text. The biblical prohibition does not merely operate at the cultural level of avoiding social exploitation. It operates at the structural level of the creation order and human anthropology.
Break that down. How does the creation order argument actually show up in the text?
First, you have Genesis 1 and 2, which establishes male-female complementarity as the normative, created form for this specific covenantal union. The basar echa, the one flesh, is structurally defined as the union of these two differentiated persons.
Jesus references that.
Yes, Jesus points directly back to that exact male-female structure in Matthew 19 as the unchangeable baseline.
What about Paul's writings? Progressive arguments often claim Paul was only critiquing localized Roman abuses.
If we look at Romans 1.2627, Paul describes same-sex relations using the phrase paraphysin, which translates to against nature or against the created order.
Against nature.
Right. The entire theological context of Romans 1 is about humanity's departure from the Creator's original universal design. It is not a critique of a specific, localized Roman social convention. Furthermore, Paul explicitly includes female same-sex activity in that passage, which completely undercuts the idea that he was only thinking of male exploitative pederasty, which was the primary social issue of his day.
The debate often centers heavily around 1 Corinthians 6, specifically the Greek words Paul uses there.
The word Paul uses is arsenokoitai. This is a fascinating linguistic study because it appears to be a word Paul coined himself.
He just made it up.
He didn't pull it out of thin air, and he didn't use the common Greek words for pederasty or commercial sex, which he absolutely knew. He constructed this new word directly from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. Specifically, he pulled it from the structural prohibition in Leviticus 18 and 20. The Greek words for male, arson, and bed, koit, are sitting right there next to each other in the Leviticus text.
So Paul bypassed the vocabulary of local Roman exploitation and instead engineered a word that points all the way back to the universal Levitical code.
He roots his argument in the historic canonical structure, and he pairs that word with malakoi, condemning both the active and passive participants in the act.
Which matters because
an exploitation-only reading wouldn't naturally condemn the passive victim of abuse. The argument the sources make is deeply anthropological. The emotional quality of the relationship, however faithful or loving it may be, does not change the created structure of the act itself. The biblical ethic requires the male-female complementarity established at creation.
And the sources are incredibly careful to reiterate that this theological firmness must never be wielded as a weapon to humiliate, mock, or isolate people. The exact same ethic that defines the structure of marriage also demands that we honor every single person as an image-bearer of God, worthy of dignity and respect.
That tension has to be held.
Let's turn to our final major category. We have established that marriage is the ultimate covenantal container, designed by God to protect vulnerable persons. What happens when that container itself becomes a place of profound, sustained harm? Let's talk about the difficult realities of divorce, abuse, and remarriage.
This is where the framework's primary goal, the protection of persons, really comes to the forefront. Jesus clearly establishes covenantal permanence as the divine ideal in Matthew 19.6. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Divorce was never part of the original design.
But Jesus and Paul both intimately recognize that we live in a fractured reality, and there are legitimate biblical grounds for dissolving a marriage to protect the people involved.
Because the covenant exists to protect persons, when the covenant is fundamentally violated and destroyed from the inside, dissolution is recognized. Jesus gives the explicit exception of marital sexual unfaithfulness in Matthew 19.9.
And he uses a specific word there, right?
He does. Notice he uses the broader word porneia here, rather than the narrower word for adultery. While adultery is the clearest case of a broken marriage covenant, this broader term recognizes that serious, sustained sexual betrayal fundamentally destroys the bond.
And Paul adds another ground for dissolution in 1 Corinthians 7.15, abandonment by an unbeliever. If the unbelieving partner walks away and severs the relationship, Paul says the believing brother or sister is not enslaved.
They are no longer bound by a covenant that the other party has completely abandoned and nullified.
This brings up an incredibly vital pastoral point from the sources regarding abuse. And I want to emphasize this as passionately as possible. Sustained physical, sexual, or emotional abuse is a form of abandonment.
It absolutely is the most severe form of abandonment. A marriage covenant is fundamentally structured by mutual self-giving, honor, and the fierce protection of the other person. If one spouse is engaged in sustained abuse, they have fundamentally destroyed the covenant they stood at an altar and claimed to hold. It is an ongoing, violent violation of the vows.
The sources state this with absolute clarity. A church or a pastor must never send an abused spouse back into a dangerous situation under the guise of covenant faithfulness or forced submission.
It's tragic how often that happens.
It is. The abuser has already broken the covenant. The immediate, non-negotiable pastoral priority is the physical and emotional safety of the victim. The entire point of the covenantal framework is to protect the vulnerable. You do not trap someone in a burning building and call it faithfulness.
Following a legitimate divorce, whether on the grounds of sexual unfaithfulness or abandonment, explicitly including the abandonment of severe abuse, the sources note that remarriage is biblically permitted.
Okay, that's good to know.
Paul refers to such a person in 1 Corinthians 7 as agamos, genuinely unmarried. They are legally and spiritually free, and entering into a new marriage is not an act of adultery.
This entire deep dive really shifts how you see the Bible's approach to human intimacy, doesn't it? We started by talking about a massive list of do-nots, a
Right.
terrifying machine you're afraid to touch.
Yeah, that old framework.
But when you look at the actual blueprint, when you understand the integrated reality of the body, the profound weight of the one-flesh union, the safety of the covenant home, the cosmic metaphor of Christ and the church, and the careful application of moral proportion, you see a system brilliantly designed for human flourishing.
It is a theological structure built from the ground up to honor the immense weight of what it means to be an embodied human being.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on. Think about how much of the modern anxiety surrounding sex, both inside religious circles and out in the secular world, comes from the deeply rooted fear of being shamed or controlled or used or eventually discarded.
That's a huge fear for people.
But what if the biblical framework isn't the oppressive cage we have been told it is? What if it's the exact opposite? What if God's design is the only framework strong enough and secure enough to allow two incredibly vulnerable human beings to give themselves completely to each other without the terrifying fear of being consumed or thrown away? What if the vault isn't there to lock you in, but to keep the thieves out?
Biblical sexual ethics begins with creation. Humans are embodied persons made in God's image. Because the body is the person, sexual union carries whole person weight. It forms a real one-flesh bond and is therefore covenant-directed by nature. Marriage is the covenant home designed to hold that union in faithfulness, exclusivity, responsibility, and honor. The goal of the whole framework is not shame or control, but the protection and honoring of persons before God.